Hello, fiends, friends, and familiars. This is Matt Orozco from Macabre Daily, and I am once again beyond elated to be joined by a guest today. We have writer, director Quinn Armstrong of the Fresh Hell trilogy, which we'll go into a little bit more detail in a moment. But Quinn, so great to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me on. This is I think the first like sit down talking interview as opposed to like typing up answers to questions interview for this cycle. So we'll see what happens.
I love it. I am somewhat of a anxious, anxiety-ridden human myself, so it's always a good time going to these, especially when I'm the first one to go. But what I love to share with everyone before we get into some questions is just a little bit about the Fresh Hell trilogy. For those unaware, there are three separate films comprising a trilogy of films under the Fresh Hell banner. The first one being The Exorcism of Saint Patrick, which will release on August 27th. And we have Wolves Against the World, which will be out on September 3rd, and Dead Teenagers on September 10th. So, with all that in mind, Quinn, my first question for you is, how did you arrive at this concept for this trilogy of films? I know that you were heavily inspired by your 12-year-old viewing of Creepshow 2, but I'm wondering how that 12-year-old Quinn translated that experience into these three feature films.
Um, I have kind of a practice of writing for a certain amount of hours a day, and I've been doing that for years. And so I have this vast library of terrible half-finished scripts and all this sort of hundreds of them. And the the idea of doing like an anthology of features started, as all good stories start, with a conversation about tax credits. Um,
Tale as old
and,
as time, really.
yeah. And the sort of like nitty gritty of trying to take advantage of the tax rebates available in Ohio. We figured, oh, if we package these three together, do we have three scripts that we can kind of like get in the same place? And so these three were not originally written to be together. Um, uh, and so I think when you look at an anthology, there's like a percentage of the anthology that is about the wraparound story and about how
Right.
all of them connect, and a percentage that's about the individual stories. And this one is heavily weighted towards the individual stories. There's some fun little connections, but it's more about setting these three stories up against each other and seeing how they kind of naturally resonate.
Right. I mean, it's such an interesting concept because, as you kind of say, like anthologies often share screen time with other stories, and as such, you often get, what is essentially the filmic version of a short story, right? You're getting just a glimpse of this. So, sounds like these all kind of started as features that, ultimately kind of came into this nice little package deal you could do for here in Ohio. Were there any stories that, were these, how did you arrive at these three up with the vast amounts you have? And I love that practice you have, by the way, because it's something I think if you ever read anything that they tell you to, best practices around how to become a writer, removing judgment of the quality of anything, just to become a writer is to just do it all the time regularly. So, how did you pick these three stories specifically?
Uh, so I find work best when I'm angry. And so two of these stories have very, very clear uh points of attack.
Right.
Wolves Against the World deals with neo-Nazis who, and I don't want to be too brave here, but I'm not a fan of.
Right.
Uh,
I think that's a pretty lukewarm take at this point. But if it's a hot take to anyone, I think we found out, that's a
yeah.
conversation they have with themselves.
Yeah, no, I think that and Exorcism, which deals with conversion therapy, both of those are subjects that I think that when you're dealing with anger in art, it can kind of seem like it's just this wall. Like it's kind of, anger is just sort of this boring wall of emotion. And I think there's a lot of nuance possible in it. And I think that was one of the things that attracted me to pairing those two stories. Um, and there was a version of this where I was thinking like, well, what if it's just those two? because they have sort of similar packaging and they echo each other a lot, and they're both primarily two-handers that deal with these issues. Um, and then the idea of introducing a kind of wild card third project that is radically different um, felt imbalanced to me. It felt like it enriches and complicates the other two. So it kind of started with Exorcism and Wolves, and then Dead Teenagers, which is a far older project, came in towards the end of the planning process.
Wow. I mean, I definitely picked up on like the kind of societal messaging that's part of Exorcism and Wolves, and it's something that I kind of thought about a little bit is that these storylines feel so current, right, to what we're experiencing, kind of as a global society, but particularly here in North America, there's just we are constantly fighting with the politics of people just wanting the right to exist, and not be hated or looked down upon or treated differently because of their existence. How do you strike that balance between the horrors that are imagined, right? That we use as metaphor, and then the real life horrors that are kind of the backing of two of these stories in particular.
So for both Wolves and Exorcism, by design, the supernatural elements are um, secondary. Uh, there's a scene in the middle of Exorcism, which is, in my opinion, the most horrible thing that happens in any of the movies, and there is zero supernatural stuff going on. It's just it's a scene that takes place in a bathroom, if you know what I'm talking about.
I
Then
do.
yeah, yeah, and it is very rough and it is real. That is just a thing that people do to each other, which it's so cliche to say, but it's so much worse. The things
Yeah.
we do to each other are so much worse than anything that this is actually one of the reasons that I liked watching anthology horror as a kid and 80s horror and stuff like that. And one of the reasons I think people like watching 80s horror in general is because it's comforting to live in a world where you can look at a monster and pretend for a minute that that's the worst thing that's out there.
Yep.
Uh, it's like cozy and comforting to look at Stephen King stuff and that sort of thing and be like, oh yeah, there's a scary clown. Because a scary clown, I could deal with a scary clown.
Right. Just don't go to Maine.
Yeah, easy. Don't go into the drains. Come on, kids. Um, it is a lot harder to deal with, the uh without getting too overtly political, the sort of moral degradation of our political systems and the violence that our neighbors and both our neighbors down the street and our neighbors in the state next door are capable of, and the violence we're capable of
Right.
when it comes to it. I don't know if that answered your question in any way. We were talking about like,
No, it does. It
okay,
does because I think because again, I think one of the things that is difficult in horror in general is you're right that sense of comfort that comes from being in a place where the worst thing that could happen is literally on screen and everything else is so unparalleled to it. But we also live in a time now where access to information is almost against our biology, right? It's like we're not meant to take in this much information this quickly all the time. So we're constantly wrestling with having to adapt and change. But at the same time, we are also noticing this kind of degradation of some of our value, our humanistic values, right? Of treating people a certain way, being kind to one another. Um, and I think that there's a lot. You are right, and I just watched The Exorcism this morning of Saint Patrick, and you're right. There are some scenes in there that really make people think for a moment, like not only is this real, but this is far worse than anything I'm probably going to see in the rest of this movie because of how it's making me feel. So I think from that perspective, you've absolutely succeeded as far as trying to bring together the two, which is what the horror of the real world is really just the horror of the movies is really just a metaphor for the horror of the real world. And given you had these three productions going on, I'm really curious to know what the production schedule was like. how quickly were you filming these? Were you doing kind of the Roger Corman thing where it's like you got multiple productions going on at once, or how did you approach it?
I think we were 16 or 17 days on Dead Teenagers. We did St. Patrick in like 12 days.
Wow.
That was a mad rush. And then Wolves was about 17 or 18 days. Um, all the same crew, all the same location. It was basic, it was like a summer camp kind of. Um, they put us up in dorms that were out of use in the local university. So we're literally just on the floor of this dorm, um, uh, in deep rural Ohio, uh, going out to a Christmas tree farm, which is where we shot most of this stuff every day, shooting 10 to 12 hour days. I'm I came up in indie film and theater. I don't I move very quickly, generally speaking. It's I've found on productions it usually freaks people out the first couple days. Because why are we what is happening? But the big thing for me is no going over. I think we went over one day of 45 days.
Wow.
And that's out of respect for the crew who is, coming out here working so hard. This was an Ohio crew, end to end, and I was just stunned by the bench of talent that exists. We had people coming out of Columbus and Cleveland for this, um, and the it is down to them that I was able to run this production like a much bigger movie in terms of how we moved through our days. We weren't shooting things simultaneously. We just did chunk by chunk by chunk, scene by scene by scene. Um, and every day we were like, okay, is this the day where we fall way behind and spend the rest of the time trying to catch up? But we never did. I was stunned by this crew.
Well, I mean, that's wonderful to hear as someone who is an Ohio resident myself. I've noticed an uptick in the amount of productions that are going on out here, similar to what Georgia saw kind of over the past few years with the television production. So, I'm curious to know, like, as far as the Ohio-based crew is concerned, what was it like sourcing that team? Given that you all were, it seemed like you were already pre-planning to do things in Ohio. So, was there already a crew that you had that the team had worked with before, or were you really just kind of trying to find and putting out basically a crew casting call to the state?
So the majority of that work, because I live in Seattle,
Okay.
um, the majority of that work was done by our producer Phil Garrett. And one thing that I really loved is I've been on a number of productions where in pre-production we're talking about crew and we're all saying like, oh yeah, it's really important that we get like people of color and queer folk and that sort of thing on this project. And everybody sort of, pats themselves on the back and shake hands, is very happy. And then you get to the day and it's like, oh, you guys, and they were like,
10
well, we
white guys.
with you. Da, 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 da. But Phil really took that to heart. I was so thrilled, and it enriches the production so much that we had uh, a quite a few people of color, quite a few queer folk, which I was just like, it also just helps everybody relax a little bit.
Right.
I think uh, I think the vast majority of our department heads were women. Um, and Phil, so found pockets of people in Columbus where he'd bring on, a DP who knows a gaffer, who knows da 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 da. And he was able to tap into the right networks to find people because and I remember speaking to some of them during production being and having them be like, yeah, sometimes I don't even apply because why bother? Everybody makes a lot of noise about caring about this, but they don't. So that really is down to Phil.
That's amazing. I mean, I do think a lot of times it's easier to say the thing than it is to actually do it. and find a diverse cast and crew. But at the same time, it does show up, I think, with the authenticity to which people can perform. And also, some cases, that's why we're seeing the rise of things like intimacy coordinators and things like that on sets, is because there needs to be someone to help synthesize the ideas, the story, the performances, the work, the technical side of it all into something that basically delivers the story you put to page. Um, and I'm curious to know, as far as challenging, rewarding aspects go, what would you say was the most challenging part of this process for you across these three films? And then what's one of the most rewarding parts of this experience for you?
I'll start with rewarding because that's easier. Uh, some of the people that I worked with on this, I will be friends with for life. I am, I will be in their corner forever. Happily work with them again on anything. It was interesting getting to know Ashland, Ohio. Deep, deep red rural area. Um, the kind of area that it's easy to make a lot of assumptions about. And some of those assumptions are accurate. And there are things that I will never agree with a lot of the people in that area politically and socially. But there's a lot going on. There's a lot underneath the surface happening, and there's growth happening, and that was just really cool to get to know an area that I would never have gotten to know otherwise. Um, Most challenging, I think. First of all, I played the antagonist in Wolves, and that was hard. He's not a good dude,
Yeah.
and I remember talking to people on set during that time and having them be like, "Yeah, the vibe on set has changed. Like like we get it and everything's cool and we're all like hanging out, but like I felt very isolated from the crew during that time because I'm walking around in this edgelord leather trench coat with my weird egg shaved head. uh it's
After saying some absurd and gnarly things.
yeah, and we all talked about it and we were all sort of on the same page about what the movie is doing, but it's still like it's a very alienated position. So that was the last stuff we shot, was some of the shaved head stuff. So it was tough to leave things on that note. But
Right. Well, I mean, now we've come out of it, and you have a full feature ready to go, so people can get the full experience rather than just those moments on set that, you know, well, while probably rose the discomfort level, at the same time also contributed to, I think, an overall great, great output. My last question for you for a wrap up here is, this is kind of a hard one to do for this. So I'd love to ask it of everyone, but it's my double feature question. What movie would you pair these up with a double feature? But since there's three of them, I'm curious, what anthology movie would you suggest people pair up with these films?
this is tricky because part of the purpose of these features is to create uh premises that are kind of like cozy horror cabin stuff, and then take them to uncomfortable places. Um,
Right.
so I think if you're going to watch these three movies, I suggest as a palate cleanser, a lovely little anthology movie from the 80s called Body Bags. Um,
John
uh,
Carpenter's correct?
yeah, John Carpenter plays the wraparound
Yep.
mortuary worker. It's got a lovely and a very fun, silly segment starring Stacy Keach, who played the lead in my first feature and is the loveliest man.
Survival Kills.
Yeah, the loveliest man you could ever hope to work with. Mark Hamill's in one. There's yeah, I think it's John Carpenter, Toby Hooper does one, and I don't remember who directed the other one, but it's a lot of fun. It is exactly what you want like an 80s anthology horror movie to be.
Outstanding choice. And that Stacy Keach story is great. It makes me have a completely different relationship to hair. But Quinn, I just want to say thank you so much for your time in this interview. And just a reminder to everyone watching this, you can go and catch these films in theaters and also on demand. They're going to come out in staggered. So Next week, we're getting Exorcism of Saint Patrick on the 27th. The following week, on the 3rd, we get Wolves Against the World. And then rounding us out on the 10th of September is Dead Teenagers. So you have no excuse, either the theater or at home. Quinn, thank you so much, and good luck with the rest of your interviews today.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. You have a good one.